Welcome to The Balancing Act, the podcast for mastering work, wealth and well-being, with me, your author and host, Sarah Brennand. Here we explore conversations, insights and expert advice through the lens of what truly drives high performance and sustainable success, aligning your money and mission, strengthening your mental and physical health, and creating a more intentional work-life balance. Each week, I'm joined by leaders, professionals and specialists who share how they navigate their own balancing act, along with practical tools and strategies that you can apply in yours. In this episode, Performance is Health in Motion, Resilience, Neuroscience and the Process Model, I'm joined by Dr. John Sullivan. John is a clinical sports psychologist and one of the world's leading experts in performance, resilience and brain-led decision-making. For decades, he's worked behind the scenes in elite sport, military and high-pressure environments, supporting those who need to perform at their best when it matters most. In this conversation, we explore neurological resilience, individual differences in high performance, and why mistakes recovery and emotional management sit at the centre of sustainable success. John also shares his process model and explains why performance oscillates rather than progresses in straight lines. This is an extended, raw interview recorded as part of the research for my book Balancing Act, offering a rare insight into the science and practice of high performance from someone who works in the shadows. Let's begin. So John, if we can start first of all by you giving a brief introduction, overview of who you are, the journey that's brought you to the work that you do today, please.
So I'm Dr. John Sullivan. I'm a clinical sports psychologist with also a background in neuropsychology and neuroscience. That's a bit of my academic journey. And beyond the academic journey with the applied piece, I've been an academic, I've been a practitioner, and I've been a researcher. Typically a mix of all three of those throughout my journey as each informs the other. I've held positions in the sectors of high performance sport, aerospace, and elite military. I came over to New Zealand 2 years ago for a position of head of psychology for High Performance Sport New Zealand, which is a government agency that oversees Olympic sports as well as pro sports, driving technical advisory or leadership, direct service work, and then research.
Okay. And what's your main area of research?
So my main area of research is neurological resilience, looking at rest and recovery. How do we rejuvenate the brain and the body and the central nervous system? So after repeated bouts of stress, how do we bounce back better? And then also looking at complex systems analysis. So what is that? So as human beings, we are a complex system within a complex system. So understanding how do we make sense of ourselves as well as we integrate with groups of people and environments.
And in terms of that research, what would be your typical person that you have or that you are working with when you're testing that kind of stress model and how the brain works and how you can understand that better to improve performance?
I think one of the things, as you just said, is a key factor. How do we test this? Well, when you work in high performance sport or any high performance environment, we can't get lost in the weeds of looking at the group. It's actually, you're always working with individuals. And so it's trying to understand an N of one. Why? Because human beings are varied. That's the rule, not the exception. So you can't take population research and use that as a direct guide to help elite individuals because they're so unique, as we all are.
Yeah.
So it's looking at the individual and then understanding how that moves to 30 individuals. How do I educate them? How do I train them? How do I develop them as opposed to a group?
Okay.
Too much detail and nuance is lost with that approach. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. I mean, typically when we're trying to understand high performance environments, we have to meet that definition. So
Yeah.
it's saying people that are just fit are not elite athletes, or they're not elite military operators, or they're not elite, astronauts or pilots. So to really a like elements transfer, you really have to look at specifically those groups of individuals. Then you can even break it down from there. If we're looking at elite athletes, are we looking at elite footballers or
Yeah.
elite hockey players or elite cyclists. So we have to get specific. That's one of the things that's
Yeah.
often is missed is an overgeneralization. If I find it in one group, I can just
Yeah.
walk it over to another. It's not the case. And then if I look at elite military operators, I may be looking at the boots on the ground to those who
Yeah.
get them from place to place. It could be
Yeah.
pilots who are using night vision goggles and how do we enhance their performance to read and react, to looking at aerospace, the elements of zero gravity and what effect does that have on the brain to manipulate decisions, right? Or
Yeah.
fine motor movement or coordination as a team. And so those are some of the environments I find myself. Another one is I
Yeah.
work with surgeons. We want them to perform
Okay.
in high pressure environments because we know what happens when they don't. And so looking
Yeah.
at those dynamics.
So what roles or experience shaped your thinking around performance, resilience, and brain-led leadership? Is that an interest that you had when you were younger? Is that something that's been shaped by particular experiences you've had as an individual or as an athlete, or or by someone that you've met? So I'm just intrigued as to at what point did you get really fascinated in the brain and the body and how we kind of create or maintain or sustain high performance?
It's a great question. Again, like how does one find their way to kind of evaluate these areas of humanness? And I could talk about a number of things because I don't think it was one, but there are two nexus points, certainly for
Okay.
me, that were I was an elite athlete. I was an NCAA Division I collegiate athlete. I was a endurance runner, a distance runner, and it just occurred to me over time that it seemed that sweat wasn't enough.
Yeah.
Certainly there is a conditioning of the neurology, cardiac system, and neuromuscular system and energy system that has to happen for one to be able to function in distance running. But you're out there with so much time, and in fact you can't focus the whole time, so you have to find ways
Mm.
of kind of managing pain, directing attention, when to distract yourself or disassociate as well as associate. So as a young athlete, I was very curious about how does this work. Like there's got to be something between the ears that matters to the performance on moving
Yeah.
faster, from A to B. And then I think it's is really having some really wonderful mentors in my master's programs and my doctoral program and helping to spur on even more curiosity, those
Mm.
challenges, those checks and challenges. I think the biggest one for me though was psychology wasn't enough of the story. There was a
Yeah. Okay.
consilience or a group of knowledge that had to happen. I wanted to know, okay, if we were doing set intervention, how is that moving the brain? And in what ways was the brain moving the other 11 systems that it manages? So for me, I wanted to understand the neuroscience of it. I wanted to understand not maybe the totality of the answer, but I wanted to know more. And I'm jealous of the students today because most psychology departments are merging with neuroscience, where I had to go kind of step out, step back in. But
Yeah.
that's an exciting thing to see later in my
Yeah.
career that, there are many people now they're having this curiosity. How do we put these two sciences together to understand more completely? But those are probably the two nexus points. There's just curiosity leads to so much more wisdom than not
Yeah.
asking the question.
Really, really good points. You said something that in there as well that I just kind of wanted to pick up on, because it relates to some of the other areas within the book as well, and I'm sure within the process model, which we'll come on to soon. You mentioned about association and dissociation. Just talk me through a little bit of that in terms of in the moment or after the moment. So just what you meant by that term, because I think a lot of people will go, oh, I know those words, but actually, what do they really mean from a science and psychology and performance perspective?
Appreciate that question. Like those are common parlance, disassociation and disassociation and ability to zoom in and zoom out of kind of our focal points. It absolutely is. And we throw around attention and what does that mean? So I appreciate the opportunity to kind of clarify that. If we go back to that dissing example and we think about a marathon, 26 miles, 385 yards, those runners are not focused 100% of their attention on the task. It's not possible because our brain has to manage energy, which has to do with survival. And so, what we tend to do in those long moments where we're doing something repetitive is we energy manage by not hyper focusing on the task, but allowing, you know, daydreaming, if you will, other processing to happen. This is why some people run and it's a great opportunity to problem solve. Yes, it's a stress relief, but they let things tick. That's a form of disassociation. It's a form of shutting off high focal point to just let our stream of consciousness run. And so when I was saying that, it was certainly um, in my journey as a distance runner was understanding that that's not bad. It's how do we alert ourselves to turn on when to focus, like marathoners. When do I start to focus where, okay, this is a moment to make a move, this is a moment to check a move, this is a moment to fuel or to hydrate. And so it's turning it on and turning it off.
I think there's some real value in how we take that and transfer it to a professional in a high pressure role across even just a working day when it is impossible to maintain 100% focus on everything you're doing all of the time, and also having read your book, or certainly the brain always wins, the first one, and now the brain always wins too. Actually our brain needs those elements of rest, doesn't it? In order to maintain high performance, you need to go from a state of being fully focused, but have these micro or longer breaks. So how do we as professionals, perhaps who've never done sport, but who want to maintain high performance in the operational work that we do, how do we allow ourselves to go, it's okay to not be fully focused all of the time, because actually that's good. So what does that kind of mean? Does your body just operate automatically whilst your brain is having a rest, or what's that? Because I guess as a runner, you don't slow down when you're daydreaming. Your body's learned to continue and maintain that momentum of high performance, hasn't it?
On a couple things, it's a great question. Okay, so how do we transport this to everyday life? Those kind of, is it contextually the same? Is there some things that are different and nuanced? And you used a term that's really key. So human beings are not good at linearity. So if anyone's watched a medical show, when someone flatlines, that means they're dead. So anything that any mammal that has a heartbeat, and especially human beings, we oscillate. So inhalation is kind of a pushing of energy through the brain, through blood and glucose. When we exhale, that's a point of relaxation. So we create a curve, get a nice cosine, right? And you mentioned these microcycles of rest. And so this is what we miss sometimes. We try to go linear with our efforts. We don't create these microcycles of rest, which then energy manage, which makes us more resilient and more efficient. And where we sometimes get stuck is thinking that efficiency is the key. It's actually not. That is important. Energy can't be wasted by the brain. It doesn't store it. We store it in our muscles, and we only have so much of it. But we do need to have resiliency. So this is where the microcycles of breaks come in. We need a balance of efficiency and resiliency. So typically what I would encourage people that are doing kind of in a work environment, as we often are, sitting in front of a computer or meeting to meeting and a little bit of both of those and some other things, is by not taking breaks, what you're doing is damaging your brain's resiliency to do what it needs to do. Have attention, focus on the most important things, move through things with pace. And most of us can keep our peak attention to about 45 minutes. That's going down because of social media and our use of devices that are attention economy pulls on us. And so it really is working in more focused cycles and then taking a break, more focused cycles and then taking a break. Now, breaking can be a lot of things. It could be fueling, it could be hydrating, it could be going for a short walk. It could be a conversation that is important to the work day, but that change of pace and dynamic is different than sitting in front of a computer and just doing email. And so it's that never breaking that cycle of that cosine. Work, rest, work, rest, work, rest. But our lives are really kind of much more linear now. And that's not helpful to our overall resiliency.
So I suppose for people to recognize that the rest is really important, but the type of rest, it isn't, that just go and sit down for 5 minutes and then come back to your desk. It's a change of focus, or a change of, as you said, the up and down. A different point on that scale gives the brain what it needs to be able to then come back to the higher level again afterwards.
There are ways to measure this now that we've never had. So when I started working in biofeedback and neurofeedback, the computer size and the instrumentation that you needed to wire someone up was quite large. Um, again, but that's my iPhone now probably has the computing power of my first four laptops I ever owned. And so everything's gotten smaller, everything's
Yeah.
gotten more impactful. So they now have headphones that actually will read your brainwave. And so
Wow.
as you're working, they will start to give you an assessment of when you need a break. They also can give you choices of how to use music to enhance your attention and your energy levels. And then the other piece is you could just do a baseline assessment on how well is your environment set up to give attention. And attention is really to define that as a three-part process, actually. It's not a one and done sort of thing. It's one, being alert. It's then tracking a pattern. Then you finally get to executive attention. Do I do this behavior or do I inhibit? Do I hold back because I need to ponder or it's not effective and I'm reading my patterns? But we really do have technology to dial in that fatigue level of going, this is when the push is and this is when the break is.
And just out of curiosity, do you use that kind of technology, or do you work with companies, or where would you go to if you're interested in finding out more about that kind of thing?
So I'm a scientific advisor for a number of companies. I've never gotten paid for any of those positions because I really wanted to stay true to the science and tell companies when they're trying to sell science as opposed to do science. And those are two very different things. And one is a very longer, rigorous path to actually do science. So a company called Enophones, ENO phones. So I do use them, and we have them available for our staff to actually purchase because we see that as a benefit to the health, but also the performance, which are always intertwined. And I've certainly used them on athletes to test out their pre-competition routines. Are they listening to music that's really pushing their heart rate too high, so now they're burning energy? Or is their use of music dialing in their brain, their heart, and their gut, the center of the body? And so we're dialing that in and getting very specific. So yes, I do use them. They're great headphones, even if you don't turn on that function, but it's a nice function to have to be able to kind of test what you're doing.
Wow. I find that fascinating with music, because I think majority of us will absolutely recognize that different music makes us feel in different ways. And I know when I've been out running and I've had the headphones in with a random playlist, and one of my kids' songs accidentally kind of is the next one because it's on shuffle, and it just ruins focus. And but equally, if I'm wanting to chill out, I know I'll put a different playlist on. But it's fascinating to think that the data that you're gathering from, is this the right song? Even if they're enjoying it, is it helping their heart rate and their preparation in the right way, rather than just find something you enjoy or that motivates you? Actually, is it, what's it doing to your heart rate? Is really, really fascinating. Yeah.
And again, we forget music moves us. There's no doubt about that. And you gave a great example right there, how music moves us. And I always say this example because we've seen it. We've seen often people listening to music in public and they're singing and dancing. They may not be able to hear their voice, but they're actually singing and dancing. And if you ask them to do that with their headphones off, they wouldn't do it. And it's a great example of how through the middle ear, which connects the vagus nerve, which cuts the brain, the heart, and the gut, that if we work with some of our sensory inputs, we can measure things, but we can also move things in particular directions that we want. And you're right, it's very intuitive. All of us know that music kind of does and has these impacts. But you're right, when we can add precision data to it, then we can look at routines and processes and apply them not just in a subjective way. I feel like this works. We can apply some knowledge objectively, like, yes, this is a sweet spot. We can work with this.
And for somebody who doesn't have the technology to help them, what would be a recommendation as to how they could work some of it out? Is it that they might already know a song, or that becomes a trigger that goes, actually, I know that listening to that before going to do a presentation gives me a bit of a boost, or I know if I'm frustrated and I put this particular song on, is that the kind of thing that you could do without the technology behind you? Are there other examples that you might have?
It's a great question. Is there other technology and other tools in that span? And I like that because typically that is what I'm looking for. Not
Yeah.
just a tool. because we have different contexts and we have different opportunities. And so you want to look at what's the span of tools that are available to people. The simplest thing actually is anything under 100 beats per minute is going to lower our heart rate and our brainwave, and our perception and our felt experience. And so DJs, you gave a great example. DJs do this all the time.
Yeah.
So they understand the beats per minutes of songs of how they can mix them together. That's why if we've ever been somewhere and a DJ doesn't mix it well, we notice immediately because it's a
Yeah.
disruption in rhythm, which
Yeah.
affects kind of our experience of it, but it does affect kind of the layers of heart rate and brainwave and those sort of things. So anything under 100 beats. And a lot of the systems where we store music on now, we have that ability to tag that and then it'll display the beats per minute. If it isn't on a platform where you store your music, if you type in the song title into Google or any search engine and you write BPM or beats per minute, it'll come up
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
the DJs have been tagging this music for a long time. And so it's probably accurate in the system somewhere. So you can make a playlist of under 100 beats per minute. There's a little bit of variation there, but it's at least a
Yeah.
benchmark of putting
Yeah.
a complex playlist together. And yes, you can imagine anything under 100 beats per minute is going to create a different energy exchange and certainly increase our heart rate, increase our breath rate, increase our brain waves.
Wow. That's a lot of, yeah, from just a quick Google and then finding some songs and then actually knowing that it can have this effect on you and you can just therefore feed it into your day is really valuable. I'm going to try that on Google later on. Definitely. Um, so coming on to the process model, start by telling me a little bit about your first book, The Brain Always Wins, and what's led you to develop the follow-on, which has just recently been released. That'd be fabulous.
I appreciate it. Great question. Again, going back to like how do we come here with The Brain Always Wins? What was the motivation behind it? And honestly, as we talk about in the book, and it's written in a very conversational tone, which is a kind of a value basis for my co-author Chris Parker and myself, is that often science gets locked away, written in language. Although every science has its language where it's jargon and it's quick communication between those who share that discipline or that scientific background. And so, from that standpoint, we've always felt that we need to take that science out of those environments and write it in very accessible ways because science is a gift. We see that more and more post COVID. Also, we live in a time of disinformation and misinformation, so facts do matter. But if we're
Yeah.
not speaking in conversational tone, in accessible language, we're really not giving the gift of, and all of us as scientists stand on the shoulders of others. We're not conveying the knowledge which can help us all as human beings. So the book started out of a conversation out of those both passionate ideas. But we were also, I was sitting with someone, Chris Parker, who's very curious, who
Yeah.
wanted to understand my background, very similar to your initial questions as well. Want to understand what led me into this and what do I know about the brain, because it is a curious thing um, that we don't learn much about. We tend
Yeah.
to know more about colon health and eye health than we do about brain health. So, what it came from was him asking these questions, and I actually was answering sometimes in the affirmative. Well, the brain always wins.
Yeah.
And because the brain is a predictive organ, it is protecting us and predicting 4 minutes ahead. It's protecting us in our pattern recognition. It's protecting our energy. It's learning our choices in the environments that are most productive for our survival, but it tacks on to bigger than that: success, quality of life, those sort of things. And so it came out of a conversation in a restaurant in Nottingham. I had never had a dream to write a book. I had written journal articles and chapters in books, always had a strong feeling like psychology and neuroscience should be taught in accessible ways. I shouldn't
Yeah.
just be teaching, and talking at the 50,000 foot level. And so, really, it started with that inspiration. And what we were looking to do is really provide brain science, brain health, and brain performance, not just to elite athletes, to the moms and dads out there, to the workforce in every sector. Here's an opportunity to understand a little bit more about yourself, because if we understand our brain, we do understand more about ourselves. And as we got into what do we put in a book such as this? Because by no means am I saying this is the end all and be all in brain health and brain science. That wasn't the goal, and we would never be finished. We'd still be writing if that was the goal. But it was how to put together, from an evidence base, a process. And although we use that mnemonic and kind of process model in the book, the brain works off of processes. So what our process was to understand what are the biggest levers all of us have in our lives to create brain health and brain performance, because we don't, and this is a little bit of talking about complex systems. We have control over nothing in our lives. It's absolutely an illusion, and we're taught it and we're kind of fed it. But the cool part is that we have influence and management over everything. And so we looked at all the data and what we would call meta-analyses in science. What does the sum or the collective science say about these things and its effect on brain health and brain performance? And then how do we write about those? And what popped out to us was we were constantly talking about process, constantly talking about all this stuff interlinks. It's not one thing, it's a connected number of things. It's never one size fits all. And you were right earlier, you were saying we've done this in other environments. Yeah, we've done it in education, we've done it in medicine, we've done it in sport. And so you're right, we wanted a bespoke model with understanding the factors that would collectively come together for someone. Some may be a little bit larger for some, and some might be a little smaller, but they all connect to a larger whole of opportunity. And the process model that jumped out from the science was exercise, physical activity. Exercise is medicine. Nothing outperforms it. And it's just human motion and movement of blood and how that stimulates the brain and the other systems. We talked about it earlier, rest and recovery. All the stimulation we do doesn't amount to much without rest and recovery. That's where everything cements. Tissue growth, neurological transmission, and really kind of really protective mechanisms. Then looking at nutrition, optimal nutrition. Food is also medicine, and we only eat for two reasons: to produce neurological transmission, so neurochemicals, and produce some vitamins and minerals that'll go alongside them. Yes, we've developed the ability to um, have ambiance, have preferences, not have to be worried about poisoned about food, have a food channel. But we eat for energy and neurotransmission. And so to really kind of get the basics on that, and that helped to connect, because often we talk about even those first three as separate things. No, 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 no. They're always connected. The other one that's gotten a little bit more popular is looking at cognition, our thoughts. How do we train aspects of that, like attention, which we've talked about? So that really jumped out. Are there ways in which we can train and preserve? And then the next one that really is kind of a critical one that is getting a little bit more attention these days, because we're kind of taught not to have them or not pay attention to them, is emotion regulation. Emotions run the show in sport and life. We're often taught that we think first, then feel. It's actually feel first, then think. But they're a very supportive process that connects the rest of the chain. And then we were looking at socialization, which all of us know so much more about due to the isolation we received from COVID and the data we see on the other end that we're social beings and how it stalled people's social resilience, but also kids' development and these sort of things. And the last one really highlights what we've been talking about a bit, synergy. How do we bring this together in a bespoke human variation attention model that goes down to the individual? No training process is going to look the same, but these are the component parts. How do we find the right chain or mix that produces the results the person's looking for? And that just came out from the research. We got it by the evidence base.
You said something there that I think a lot of people will associate with, but value being reminded of as well, is that we can't actually control anything. Because from a coaching perspective, but also a training perspective, there's a lot of people who go, I have a need to control things, or I need to be more comfortable not controlling them. And actually that reminder that actually control is it doesn't have a fence around it. You can't control everything. And I think, I even wrote it down here. It's what you can do is look at how you can influence and manage things, which of course they are not static. They are a moving thing that we have a go at doing as best we can. And how we do it on one day might be different and might need to be different to how we do it on the next day, because the things or the people that we are, take the word, wanting to control, actually all we can do is our best to influence it and manage them. And those people, as we started off this conversation, are unique, and so every day they're going to turn up with a different mindset and a different set of needs, or a different set of things that are distracting them. And the same goes for kind of projects that we work on. As much as we'd like an Excel spreadsheet to not change, it's going to change every time we put a figure in it, and it's going to skew the figures, and other people will input into it. So I think that's hugely just a valuable thing to remember as a point of reframe when you're getting stuck in the how can I control these things. And then across the process model that you've just explained, all of those elements, the physical activity, rest and recovery, nutrition, cognition, emotional management, socialization, and synergy, all of those things are moving feats every day, aren't they, that we can do our best to understand, manage and influence. And the bit comes from understanding first, so that we can better manage and influence, I guess. And that's where your model, which is deeply scientific, but at the same time, which is why I've loved using it for years, is in a simplistic way. You've got it to go, here's my checklist, what do I need to remember to understand a little bit more each day if I can, so that I can better manage and influence it for my own performance, and therefore to better understand and help and develop the performance of other people. And that's from the most important people in your life, your family and your friends, right through to colleagues and wider businesses, or just somebody that you might meet on the street and have a conversation have a conversation with. Yeah,
You touched on a number of things that dovetail off, which are pretty important. If you think about what you were saying, like when I present the idea that control is an illusion, and we found this out as human beings in many different ways, and those are interesting stories. But just to touch on what you were saying, but we have influence and management of everything. When we think about the long arc of human evolution, that's pretty good. That's got us where we are today, and that's the way it's worked. And then when you add in there the process model, that these are a checklist of things that we have management over every day. This is how we have in human existence done pretty well. Because if we
yeah,
look at how human beings have, and we can look across the anthropology research and the evolution of the human brain, that all of these have connected to us to have the brain we have today. We had to
yeah,
move. We
yeah,
had to figure out how to rest and recover. We had to, through proper nutrition and changing in nutrition over time, our brain evolved. So we had
yeah,
more cognition, we had emotion, and actually the brain grew more out of emotional patterning than cognition, the lower levels of the brain. We had to figure out what worked for us, and we had to absolutely connect with others, collective potential, otherwise we wouldn't have survived. So when you look at
yeah.
the evolutionary part of the human existence, hey, you're just being able to influence and manage and then work a process, it's gotten us pretty far. But we just don't
Yes.
talk about it.
A lot of what I talk and write about, and speaking to people about, is that success is no longer, well, it probably never was, but people very much talked about it as a linear process of, this is a thing I want to achieve. And actually it's about how we redesign that and go, okay, but that's just in one element of your life. That's the thing you want to achieve in work, or that's the thing you want to achieve at home or in sport, in terms of long term, or just on Friday that's coming up. But they all connect, because you're one person, and you're having to manage your energy flow and manage your focus and manage the different balance and the integration of everything that we choose to do. And when you can look at all of those elements in isolation, but then you need to connect them, which for the process model is that synergy bit that goes, because they all need to work together, so that from the balancing act perspective, you would do achieve success in the way you want to, rather than achieve one thing and therefore forego other things because you kind of forgot to focus on them, or you forgot to build them into your plan. And the process model and the work that you're doing, where it's positioned in the book is in the resilience advantage section, which is one of the key calibration tools. And it's there because the calibration tools underpin all of the different elements. If you want to perform well in financially, or to develop the purpose and the mission that you're on from a corporate perspective, or in mental or physical health, or making sure that your work life integrates, the things that you've talked about, that's important across all of those things. Nutrition and focus and rest and recovery for a really high pressured presentation, or just really important meeting that you've got, or mentorship, is as important as it is for the run or the hike or the cycle that you might go on, as it is for how you relate with your family through the emotional and the cognition load. It comes back to, doesn't it, that we are all unique individuals, I guess, and having that model gives us a guide, and then we apply it in the way that is going to benefit ourselves in the best possible way.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things you started with there is critically important about why the brain always wins. The way it's presented to most things are a process. And in fact, a good area of competency and expertise, if you can't explain things as a process, you're likely don't understand them. And as scientists, we kind of look at that. So cells do different things in different environments. So if I understand what a cardiac cell is doing, the reductionist scientific approach instead of the holistic approach and complex systems approach is, okay, then if I understand what's happening in the cardiac level, I can just bridge it up. That's actually not true. And so if you don't understand things as wholes, and so if I bring it to an example of elite performance, so if we take the process model, as a clinical sports psychologist and neuropsychologist, I'm only standing at certain points of that, but I am trained to identify and refer. So if there's problems with nutrition, I'm referring to a sports nutritionist. It takes a team of experts to really drive this from a holistic standpoint. And so you're putting a multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary team of experts to really drive this model. And so it becomes an individualized program of excellence, very similar to what we do in academics with, under, not higher educational environments, but a little lower, but you do see them in higher education, it's individual education plans. And so you have everyone sitting around the table who can apply expert knowledge to something that's going to fit the person to accelerate their development. And so when you look at the process model, that's a similar thing. You have to take a holistic look. As a psychologist, if I believe for an hour a week or hour every 2 weeks or hour every 3 weeks that I sit with someone, that I understand the total totality of how, I'll use a scientific term here, the person or organism is actually interacting with their, who's the fool in this? That would be me. And so it's understanding that all these things matter, but sometimes bringing in other experts to create a flourishing model of holistic health. Health is the foundation for human performance. Performance is an expression of health over time. It's not this linear model like you talk about. No, it's exactly right. It's not linear. Yeah. Most models are, though. Yes.
Yeah. And I guess from a business perspective, you can instantly just transfer that and go. When you're looking at a business, at a strategy, you don't sit in a room and go, I'm going to write this strategy in isolation. You might do if you're starting out as an entrepreneur or a founder and going, I need to start with something and then grow it. But large organizations have boards. They have executive boards, or they have their senior leadership team. They have a group of people that don't all, they're not all the director of finance. They're not all operational. They are a collective mix of different people, experiences, backgrounds, expertise, who each contribute. And we know this in business. And yet when we do it for ourselves, we quite often forget to apply that collective expert and process approach and individuality to our own development. We just go, right, I need to go down that route. I need to get that help or that support or that mentor or that trainer. And that'll enable my success, rather than remembering that we can't do that and forego the other elements. We need to bring those along, and we might focus in different parts depending on what we want to achieve, but we need to bring the rest along as well. Absolutely.
Otherwise there's gaps, and honestly, the way I was trained, in psychology, but also just understanding neuroscience is if I'm sitting with someone and say they come in with a relatively common thing and we see it raising in our society due to many factors, but let's just go with anxiety. Everyone's felt some level of anxiety. And I'm not taking a holistic approach of understanding the demands of their life, the quality of socialization that they have, what are their eating habits. And as a psychologist, that is not my realm of expertise, but it is to identify and then get them to the right place. But if I miss asking about that, we may have neurotransmission that relates to that emotional regulation or dysregulation. So if we're not checking it, then we don't understand it. And we certainly can't evolve a multi approach of solutions to it to help that person move, or their timeline to move be very different. How much they move during their day does matter. What are their thought processes? Do they have good focus when they want it? Besides the anxiety, what's the rest of their emotional experience? And then certainly looking at how do we put this together? One, what we can work on in the room, and what do I have to kind of assist them to make the connections with other professionals who complete the picture. And so we can have a training program that's very much focused on putting the person first, but their strengths first to leverage against any developmental areas. No one discipline can see that, but we can put reminders in a checklist so we make sure we check those off and we work on them.
Yeah, it's really important. So I suppose just to add to the process model, can you just give one example that somebody that, you've gone, this person uses it in this way and this is how it's influenced their daily life or their approach, just as a really kind of simple example of application in kind of, normal setting?
No, that's no problem. I think it's a great question. How can we take information from the book and then kind of push that forward, whether you're working with someone or you're independent and have the book? We'll start with that first one. Part of the book really is an opportunity for people to increase their self-awareness and check on their strengths. I tend to work, often people think as psychologists that you're working with weaknesses. Actually, I've never really worked with a system or with an individual where I didn't see strengths. They may present with concerns. Maybe they're high performing and there's no problem there at all, but they want to maintain it, something that certainly people will experience if they've gotten to a particular level. But the big thing about kind of the book is great self-awareness about where are you doing well, because high performance is about subtlety. Rarely it's about building from the basement up. If you're a high performer, you're there for a reason and you have innate abilities. Most of those are trained over time. They are not genetic. We know that. The 10,000 hour rule and the genetics, it really is not the weight that people think. It is long term of training your central nervous system or your brain and your body to work together. And so the book is about self-awareness. Where are my strengths? Where are the areas of development? So where do I have to put my energy to level up things so we have a process and of a chain of events or a chain of processes and routines daily? They don't have to be perfect. Brain doesn't like perfect. It's never seen it. Actually, that's an analogous to a control environment where it produces more anxiety in people, and they tend to underperform when they do that. So it's putting a chain of events that are good enough routines over time that build neurological resiliency, meaning we have to be able to manage flux. So you've been mentioning it in some of the things we've been chatting about in some of your questions, and it goes back to this control piece. You don't make people very resilient if they're only used to a flow of dynamics or information or workload that is only able to do X. We make more resiliency when we make space for our neurology to be able to respond to things that are surprises, things we didn't account for, changes in schedule, changes in demands and energy. So the process, when I've worked with people, it's about where are your strengths, then where are your areas of development, which makes more subtlety, more focal points. And then really the feedback loop is going to try new things and thinking about things in new ways and evaluating subjective and objective data, and then say, okay, now we're landing in a spot of that person says X, that my quality of life is improved. I do have more attention span for longer periods of time. I it takes a lot longer for me to get stressed, to really kind of feel close to feeling overwhelmed. And so I'm always anchoring on self-assessment, from the book is a good place to start. Even if I'm
Yeah.
working with someone, uh, I may take things out of the book and say, this is again facilitating supportive exercises post, right?
Yeah.
We know that an hour a week isn't going to cut it for behavior change. There has to be systematic pieces. Now, it may not be reading in the book. It may be exercises like we've talked about in the book that are very experiential.
Yeah.
And so you want to work with the person and how they work, again, strength-based. Reading may be beneficial, watching something, listening to a podcast that highlights some things, or experiential things that drive feedback loops back for discussion. But generally look at strengths, look at areas of development, put the plan together, then develop your feedback loops off of that.
I'm just going to pick up on an area because I think it will relate to a lot of people. You talked about resilience and in the association with change and how, if we do the same thing, then change is more likely to kind of derail us because we won't be used to it. What's your take on how do we develop resilience in readiness for change when perhaps we haven't had a lot of change already? So, if there's a lot of research and literature and people talking about how something big impacted them, and then because of that they almost bounced back and they built resilience and they learned from it. But what happens if we've never had a big thing that's derailed us and learned from it? Is it that we have to have had that in order to kind of learn, and then, or how can we proactively prepare for change so that it never really derails us? We just kind of build up our resilience to it. What's your
A
view or your
line of
thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like, okay, so how do we develop resilience, and is there markers of how you would start such a process, or is there other ways to kind of work this process? I mean, you're talking about a line of research that is quite interesting. A lot of times in psychology, we have to have concern for keeping people safe and keeping people healthy. So when you think about the research in acute stress or post-traumatic stress, or often it's referred to as post-traumatic stress disorder. The military environment I come from as a subject matter expert, we don't use the disorder piece because it's a natural reaction to very high level stress the majority of humankind are not wired for. So it's not a disorder. It's just signaling. And
Yeah.
so one of the ways to think about the process you're talking about is the line of research where people have been a part of really difficult situations. Maybe it's family situations with neglect, been in a fire, a car crash. You work repetitively in trauma environments like in emergency department, you're a nurse, you're a surgeon, or you have been in war. Not everyone develops acute stress or post-traumatic stress symptoms. So the line of research is, why not? And so
Mm.
that gave us that line of understanding what are the factors, the protective factors that allow people to be more neurologically resilient. And notice that term I'm using, psychological resilience, or psychological safety is a weaker set of science, but neurological resilience, neurological safety is much more well defined. And so what they found from that research was a number of things that we have highlighted in the process model. And we've added to additional one that I'll speak particularly about in The Brain Always Wins too. When we
Mm.
wrote the first book, there was a lot of stuff on the cutting room floor because, as you can imagine, right? You have
Yeah,
a
yeah.
word count. You have to think about the people you're writing for.
Yes.
You don't want to throw everything in the kitchen sink. So one of the things we left out that's been additional, because it came up from questions from our readers, is the very
Yeah.
question you just asked. A lot of this depends upon science from a 15th century, who is known as the father of toxicology, Heraclitus. And so what he talks about in his what he noticed in working was everything's a poison. It just depends upon the dose.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so when we look at high performance environments, when we look at trying to dose neurological resilience, whether it mean trying to get someone faster, have more endurance, longer focus, or sustained communication in high pressure environments like between pilots or between a surgical team, you have to dose the training to not make the hardest thing the first thing you do. Think about it, if you're a horrible coach, you're asking people, well, forget that. Human beings do this January 1 all over the world. They
Yeah.
go for 2 weeks to the gym and bury
Yes.
themselves and then wonder
Yes.
why they're demotivated and don't want to go back because that signal from the brain is you overdosed it. And
Yeah.
if they do a smaller dose, what happens is what we notice is we have a what we call a biphasic response. So if we
Yeah.
low dose stimulation, that once we come encounter with higher stress, the brain and the body will build its resiliency and react in ways that are multiplied in our healthy response. So they see this in how they dose radiation in cancer treatment,
Yeah.
how they dose toxicology in cancer treatment. But every living thing has what we call a hormetic response. Low dose gets you there faster to have higher resiliency. But as human beings, we love to overdo it.
I'm just thinking of January now because the amount that's out there, you have dry January, run every day, red January, don't you? All of the gyms put out their memberships, so you're also trying to get to the gym, and then all these other kind of New Year's resolutions. It's kind of choose the poison and introduce it steadily, I guess is the it is the for all sorts of things, which makes so much sense. I mean, I remember in going off topic a bit now, but I remember in lockdown there was this 25 press up challenge where you do 25 press ups a day. And I remember joining in with a friend and doing it and thinking, oh gosh, this is quite hard. But then I decided, and it must be about 3 years ago now. Obviously, that was after the challenge. I was really busy. I wanted to make sure I was doing some exercise every day. So I just started doing 20 press ups every night so that at least I was doing something, even if I couldn't get to, because it doesn't take much time at all. If I couldn't get to the gym or I couldn't get out on a run or anything else. And actually, it will be probably, yeah, maybe 3.5, 4 years now, but I'm now up to 50 press ups every night. I don't think I'll ever really do more because I can already feel myself going, oh, it just feels like it's just enough amount of time that it isn't getting in the way of anything, which is daft. It's only a few minutes. But then I recognize when I do go and do training or Thai boxing, whatever, that just that baseline is just there already, even if I've had, a couple of weeks
Mhm.
off. And when they go drop and do so many press ups, actually, it's not that bad anymore. It's not as painful. Just by
Yes.
doing, as you said, my evening poison of, which I
Yes.
hadn't thought
Yes.
about it before. It was more a motivate. It was more trying to make sure I was committed to something when I knew that other bits would have to kind of wait or move around based on what I was doing. But no, I really get that, and I think sometimes we do forget. Or when we have conversations, which I do have with friends or colleagues, and they go, "I haven't been to the gym enough," or "I've eaten I haven't eaten well this month." Actually, you don't need to be perfect for big blocks of time. You need to kind of just build up and create patterns. And I
Yes.
think again that sentence of performance is health in motion is like gold. That when you want to kind of fall back on it and go, actually, it's a moving process. I need to maintain it, and that will kind of coming back to your really early stages that energy flow in, heart rate, everything will have variances and degrees as to how much we can do and choose to do each day and each minute and across the year. So yeah, I really like that.
Just a couple things that dovetail off a couple comments you made. This is why when they talk about the first of the year, and they look to interview psychologists to talk about motivation and these sort of things, they talk about goals and those goals being much smaller process
Yeah,
goals. Well, again, that has to do with dose. Everything
yeah,
is dose dependent. Helping the person gauge the dose because what we also know are rules of kind of the number one rule of psychology and neuroscience are the first two laws of energy for physics, right? Conservation,
yeah,
energy in and energy out. So we're
yeah,
constantly poisoning ourselves by our dose. The central nervous system and the brain is wired to survive. So you're going to get signals of demotivation, pulling back, rest, and recovery. Even though that may not be the ultimate goal, it may be a fitness level or some sort of fitness
yeah,
goal involved in some way. Some of the ones you even mentioned, or some of those contextualized, but you'll hear people
yeah,
say, well, your brain is wired to survive. So why give you those signals? Because if you go anymore, you're going to kind of get stale or burned out or
yeah,
injury. And
yeah,
so that's another contextual thing about, in The Brain Always Wins too, we talk about is these are just signals. The brain is constantly giving us information about our status point, but we're trained in Western environments not to listen. And
Yeah.
so if we have
Yeah.
some of these anchor points to understand the
Mm.
brain is giving these signals because the dose is becoming poisonous and we learn to listen, we have our own bespoke system of governing ourselves about our choice on our checklist. What are we moving
Yeah.
towards? And so, and we all can get there. But if we understand what the signals mean, then we can go back, if you will, to the process model and go, okay, if we're going to
Yeah.
move faster or forward, I got to anchor a little bit more on rest and recovery because of the signals I'm getting. Now, yes, you can get more precise with objective data.
Yeah.
Absolutely. When we're looking at elite environments, we're looking at heart rate, we're looking at brainwave, we're looking at contextual information between the heart and the body. We're also looking at, brain access. We're
Yeah.
looking at measuring bloods and what we would call wet labs. And so we can get that, but it all comes back to these principles.
Yeah.
And we're teaching the athlete what that feeling means, which we call interoception. What does that mean? When I get those, so we're helping them understand their own biofeedback by these measurements. We're not just looking at them as lab rats and poking and prodding them. It's for a reason because in competition or high stress environments with pilots and surgeons and elite operators, they have to be a master of themselves to understand how to move towards resiliency because I'm not around. And if we're building
Yeah.
dependency, we're not building natural neurological resiliency. So we're trying to feedback those feedback loops for understanding and constant
Yeah.
growth. Yeah.
And just it's just kind of made me think of burnout as you've been talking about that, because I think that's becoming much more prevalent, but also because it's probably more openly talked about as well. So is
Mm.
burnout then in kind of when people refer to it in daily life or from a work perspective, is that poison overload? That it's got to a point where it's got too intense, or is that a similar thing?
If we talk about pathway, and really everything's on a spectrum when we look at
Yeah.
it, and so when we talk about burnout, you have a middle ground of kind of staleness, and then you have the entryway is fatigue, and fatigue's not necessarily a bad thing, it's a signal, right?
Yeah.
And that is a signal for change, and it's a signal for change of behavior we may have, but also with organicity with systems in our body. So that's just a signal for the process to move towards resiliency. But if we
Yeah.
keep pushing it, then we start to get stale. And then we're moving to burnout. And they all have symptoms that cross over into our primary symptoms of neurology, which is anxiety and mood lability or depression. Like that
Yeah.
change in high and low, that change in high and low. And so it's paying attention to the early parts, prevention. What does fatigue mean? And it's multidimensional. It's not unitary. It's okay, you can have cognitive fatigue. You can have
Yeah.
emotional fatigue. You can have physical fatigue. You can have all three. But they're signals. And typically what happens, you start with one and then it gets louder. The second one comes in and the third one, because to your point, the brain is trying to protect itself. It's predicting. It knows the energy you're going to have to put out. We just
Yeah.
don't listen. And we're taught
Yeah.
not to listen. And again, I just go back. We're all in this. I don't think I'd know anything about the brain if I hadn't studied it. I really don't. I mean, we just, and
Yeah.
especially at my generation, I mean, think about the monikers we use in the throwaway lines. Muscle memory. Muscles don't have memory. Never have, never will. And so we avoid talking about the brain even with our common
Yeah.
language.
Yeah.
And so I don't speak at this coming down and talking down. I really don't think I would know very much. And I think we're all at that disadvantage, but we all
Yeah.
have an opportunity.
And it's interesting actually splitting out fatigue, even that, is it emotional fatigue? Is it physical and is it cognitive? And actually, again, coming back to the individuality, I mean, it is on a scale, but even looking at communication styles and those that are more extreme extroverts, the more extreme introverts, a cognitive fatigue, that the response to that and the need in terms of rest is going to express differently in different people. Someone with
Absolutely.
cognitive fatigue who's more introverted is probably going to need a quieter, calmer space to recover cognitively, whereas somebody else who is more dominant extrovert or who thrives on more kind of lively or more areas of more stimulus, that will be a space that they would choose to go to to kind of get cognitive rest. And I think even just recognizing how people recover differently
Yes. Yes.
is interesting. But it also helps to explain when someone goes, I'm really tired, actually, is it mentally tired or is it physically tired? Because some people would hit the gym because they're mentally
Mhm.
tired, and you know,
Yeah.
and someone who's physically tired might. So yeah, it's that in itself is just always a good reflection and reminder about that individuality of not just the stimulus, but the response mechanism and where we choose to go from that.
Yes. And that goes back to again the synergy of the process model. Like it is going to be bespoke. And there is
Yeah,
going to be some learning of figuring out what fits and what
yeah,
is best for you or what are the best choices. And it really get even closer to home, everyone talked about when we did have the gift, like you and I are
yeah,
connecting internationally with virtual work and have conversations with loved ones and all that. But we know when we moved to it during COVID, there was this discussion about Zoom fatigue, if you will,
yeah,
online
yeah,
fatigue. And we have data to show because we regulate ourselves by conversation. Another reason
yeah,
around the book coming from conversation was an interesting piece that
yes,
that's what fatigues us sometimes is although I can see you, we're not getting, and you can see me, we're not getting that full contextualized experience of
yeah,
sitting with someone. And
yeah,
that's evolutionary, that we regulate ourselves, we inspire ourselves, we connect with others through conversation. And when we don't have it, or you have to spend 8 hours online,
yeah,
yeah, people find a little bit of fatigue with it. And then the
yeah.
question is, what is best for you to recover now? Yeah.
And then because of that, I think quite often that can become functional as well, can't it? People stack things back to back and then expect to, you know, press leave meeting and then 3 minutes later join another one with a fresh mind, thinking about something completely different in a completely different headspace with different people, and you haven't got that micro break. Or if you
Hmm.
did, it was so micro that you maybe didn't even recognize it because you were too busy getting your notes for the next thing. Yeah, that's
Yes.
definitely something that's ramped up and is much more common.
And you can go back to again the psychology and neuroscience of this with the law of conservation and looking at physics, which does relate to everything in the sense of giving someone kind of a moniker of how this works is all of us have been to the beach and we've all probably played in the sand and we probably played with kids in the sand. And as you kind of build up a sand pile and you get faster and faster and faster at building up that sand, we know there eventually it collapses. Well,
Yeah,
one is an example of becoming more efficient. But what matters more is that resiliency. How does that pile stay together and how do we fortify that? And that
yeah,
comes through some of the things we were talking about with the process model. How do you build your neurological resilience? Because you could become more efficient at everything, but that does not mean you will
yeah,
sustain. Both are important, but probably the most important is how do we start from a place of maintaining resiliency and building that through the challenges? And it reminded me of something you said earlier, which is really important. We actually need mistakes and failures for our
yeah,
neurological system, and in fact, to learn and grow through that resiliency. So part of the things we do in elite sport and elite military is you actually produce training for mistakes to happen. Because if
okay,
you're really thinking about it, and this happens a lot, but not in life and death scenarios, you do a lot of pre-mortem planning. What could go wrong and have a plan for it? Sport
yeah,
often assumes I have the best plan, but then they learn
yeah,
first contact with your opponent, whose job is to frustrate you, irritate you, and annoy you, is plan A is only as good as plan B, C, and D. And so
yes,
you
yeah,
build resiliency through actually producing scenarios where people have to push their edges of growth and
yeah,
then pulling back on that and rest and recovery to solidify those learnings. But yet often what we do, another one size fits all, is we teach people to fear challenge, failure, and mistakes when mistakes are essential to learning and resiliency. They're
yeah,
essential. Brain will actually test us sometimes, what we call spontaneous rebound. So all of us have experienced learning something, and then we think we got the pattern down,
yeah,
and then we'll go back to a default.
yeah,
And that's a way of the brain testing, do I keep this new neurological channel and continue to reinforce it? And do I prune this old one?
yeah.
So it
Yeah.
actually produces these things where we're testing the need for that pathway.
So, you've just said there about actually having the mistakes and the challenges. And from a sporting perspective, you often go so far as to actually create them so that people can experience them. If we just kind of move that over into the business space and go, okay, fear of failure, someone doesn't want to do, they wonder whether they should do a job or even just discount it because they have imposter syndrome or just think, if I did that, or self-employment, for example, oh my goodness, if I did that and I didn't succeed, then I might lose a house, or I might not be able to put my children in the school that I want to put them in, or so I'm not going to do it because of what might happen if I don't make it or don't succeed. What's your advice or what's your thoughts on that? Have you experienced it yourself or worked with anybody that's had a very open fear of failure?
These are pretty common human experiences, to be honest with you, and especially in performance environments. And most of us are in performance environments. You don't have to be an elite athlete or a surgeon or a pilot or elite military operator. You just described another one, right? Business, but school is as well. We
Yeah.
have our young kids go through it. And so I'd approach this at a couple of different ways, looking at the systems level. From a business standpoint, it's very similar to sport in these ways. We don't see it as an educational community. And so because we don't communicate it as an educational community, we automatically are putting demotivating factors into the environment. We're putting pressure related factors into the environment. So from the get-go, if you want a high performance environment, you have to think of it as an educational community. Because education, although imperfect in every country, however, it is challenged to many of these same factors that business and sport hasn't. They
Mm-hmm.
have a mature system that approaches that mistakes are actually a part of the process. They're part of the developmental chain of events. For instance, professional programs, being trained as a medical doctor, trained as a nurse, trained as an engineer, trained as a psychologist, someone in business. You are put in an environment where you are allowed to make mistakes that get smaller and smaller. And so you lean in more and more and can see more autonomy, you can see more mastery, and they create a we around it, which is a model from self-determination theory, which is probably one of the strongest psychological theories by DC and Ryan, looking at how do you create people to be self-determined. You have to have them have a choice. You have to have them pick their challenges to some degree or create a we around them and then create a supportive structure for it. But in high performance cultures that are hyper competitive, we know we demotivate people. We
Yeah.
become less productive. We lean in less for engagement to create a we. And so you
Yeah.
have to start at that level about how do we communicate about the environment, how do we communicate about development and growth, and then how do we make sure we track that process of individual accountability and the group
Yeah.
support is there. So the environment I spend the most amount of time in has a lot to learn from education. I'll let you speak about the
Mm.
business piece. Having worked in business, I can see it at times. I still think there are things in business that sport can learn from. There's always that cross learning. But I think that from a systems level, that's one of the biggest mistakes. We're not
Yeah.
approaching it as learning because that's what the brain is really good at. It actually is not good
Mm.
at unlearning. And so if we create an environment that's about learning, we're again feeding the brain in very
Yeah.
particular ways. I think the other thing is people are going to have individual responses to this, which you highlighted. Right? If we think
Yeah.
about fear of success and fear of failure, we're thinking of on a spectrum and we have ends and degrees of difference in between. Talking about is again, how do we manage emotion in high pressure environments? And
Yeah.
what one of the biggest things I say that's often an undercurrent of bias and underperformance is a cognitive bias, which has existed in the literature for about 60 plus years. Even though
Yeah.
the neuroscience is very clear that we feel first then think, our lower centers of our brain that manage emotion and then our physiology functions and neurophysiology functions allowed the neocortex, the wrinkly part when we think of the brain where our cognitive functions are, um, that only grew out of our emotional sophistication. And
Yeah.
so often when I see fear of failure or fear of success, it has to do with managing emotions contextually. Yes,
Yeah.
anxiety can spread because it's designed to for survival, but usually it's context. So how do we
Yeah.
assist that person and what strengths do they have to leverage those points. And yes, you can prevent some of this by preparation. You can't prevent
Yeah.
it all. You can't manage it all, but you can see a trajectory of someone's development. And this happens, I'll say this in the pro level. So you may come into an organization, you're not starting. So
Yeah.
that sometimes is helpful for them to learn or remember some of the skills when they stepped up the last time. How do they
Yeah.
manage their emotions around pressure? But you might just step into a situation where you have to immediately start. You are immediately a productive member of the team. You're on the field, and you got to manage that. So we can see that coming sometimes. So it's to sit to
Mm.
them and prepare for success. Go through a pre-mortem planning. What are the things that I think will trip you up? What strengths do you
Yeah.
have in your past that might leverage that? And then what skills do we have to add or interventions to alleviate that? But often they're emotional first. And I'll give
Yeah.
an example that everyone has experienced in this emotional kind of balance. Most people drive A to B and they have no idea how they got there. No
Yeah.
clue. You're predicting ahead of time, right?
Yeah.
That's an efficient state on the brain, a very efficient state. But when
Yeah.
we get detours or we get a little frustrated in traffic, now emotion enters into the picture. And what
Yeah.
you see is ability to be proficient and direct yourself goes down. And so that's a
Yeah.
common everyday occurrence of how we see emotion imports into our ability to predict and behave and act or even communicate. And
Yeah.
so we could take that. How many people hate sitting in traffic? In
Yeah.
fact, I prescribe that to some of my athletes who despise sitting in traffic. Here's your homework. You have to leave the facility at peak traffic hour and manage yourself using breath rate or
Yeah.
distraction or what have you. So it's
Yeah.
seeding success by thinking through pre-mortem planning what could go wrong as you step up.
Okay. There's a lot of what we've spoken about has been how we can develop our own performance behavior, thought patterns, perception of failure, success, how we might use it in different areas of our life. Just thinking about it from the perspective as a leader who has teams to manage, or a parent or a partner, taking that in as broad a way as how can we positively manage and influence those around us. Just picking up the bit on point of fear of failure, there's a few people I've spoken to recently, when they talk about their own journey to success, very much believe that they have the resources or will be able to find the resources, and that's learning as well as physical resources, to be successful. But the bit that's holding them back is the perception of others, or the perceptions that certainly they've created from maybe from early childhood, but very much about these. I'm not sure whether these people how it would go down with them, or I'm scared of what they would think of me. So it's almost that they would be really comfortable failing in a quiet room and nobody knowing about it. But actually, the minute you open that door and have to walk out, and there's a big crowd outside going, "What was the answer? What was the result?" And obviously, we hear from athletes because they have to, every time they go out on a stage, they win or they lose to some extent, even in positioning. But in terms of daily life, that happens all of the time, and quite often it isn't. Some of it might be the individual and how they perceive those messages that they're hearing, but those messages are really crucial as well. So, as a leader, having a team and as a mum and a partner and a friend, how do I make sure to the best of my ability I am encouraging doses of poison, I'm encouraging challenges, I'm encouraging mistakes, but at the right level, and that I'm not creating a consciously or subconsciously as best, not creating this environment where people are scared to fail. Are there any tips or just recommendations that you can give?
That's a great question. Like,
Yeah.
how do I assist leaders? What work do I do at that level who have to front a culture or a culture of change? And I'll start with the first piece because I think you're alluding to it. Leadership is often lonely, and you referenced one of the pieces that can be really difficult is that uh, you're never going to have all the information to make the decision. And one of the strongest pieces, because we're social beings and we live in community networks, is people's reaction or perception of reaction, as you said it. And that's very true. So what leaders often need are the same things they should be looking for and encouraging in their employees, which is having a support network, because it is lonely and there is a lot of weight in their decisions, and often their decisions affect many people. And so if they don't have the support, and this is where high performance environments somewhat fall down. But if we think about it, if we only offer support to athletes or performers, but we don't to the leadership or support staff, you have a parallel process that if one falls, the other falls. And so
Yeah.
if you don't create, again, going back to resiliency, if we don't create a system that is resilient to buffer that from the top to the bottom, bottom to the top, everybody matters or nobody matters, you're going to create fault lines. And so I
Yeah.
would encourage them to get guidance, have a social support network, and make sure who's in their network and what parts do they serve. Otherwise, you can get quite isolated, and then you're unable to take information in from your environment and work with that information to best serve the mission and the people involved in the mission. To move to the next piece, what you're really talking about is building a culture. And
Yeah.
if we think about it, we're at a very interesting time, and it's a fascinating time that this is the example I used to use when I would talk about culture. So, in typically Western cultures where stable government's happening, if you started polling people in a street, village, hamlet, town, city, you would start to see what does it mean to be a UK citizen? What does it mean to be a US citizen? You develop these themes. Now in the US, this is why it's interesting. I can't use that example anymore
Yeah.
because the themes would be all over the place. But what does that sound like? That's an environment that's chaotic and vulnerable. Chaos is fine, but you have to find the leverage points to move it towards a place of kind of stability. But in the UK, here in New Zealand, we build these themes. If we go to a country that's very unstable, you're going to get all over the show. And so when you think about a culture, there has to be a consistent messaging.
Mm.
Comms really matter more so than ever because we are distracted by our distraction economy. And so
Mm.
our messaging has to rise above the noise about who we are, what we're about, and how we do things. Those are social norms. So if you're
Yeah.
going to create an environment of education, it can't just be in manuals and it just can't be in a book or in a policy. Those are important, so you can point to them, but it has to be
Mm.
enacted. And it has to be an active daily sort of thing. It has to become part of the language, part of the messaging. I'm often amazed. Here's a funny takeaway story that I knew a coach used to do. So, but I think it was a brilliant thing because sport coaches, when they really embrace the role, they know they're educators. So they would have
Yeah.
signage all over the facility. It could relate to health, it could relate to performance, it could relate to resources for their family. And he would go, these turn into wallpaper. So, and everyone just walks by him. So I move them around to change their environment so people take notice of the
Yeah.
resourcing, the messaging. And yes, there is importance to have some stability, but he was right about that. You change the
Yeah.
pattern, it changes the message. But I think if we're not thinking about a sincere comms plan of who you are, you're not creating social norms. And so that's a
Yeah.
really important piece. Then you have to build activities around it. And building activities then creates traditions, creates opportunities, creates engagement, creates innovation.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think
Yeah.
those are the pieces. We don't support leaders and we don't create cultures, truly cultures. And we have science on how we do this. They're just taglines and will never rise above the noise of the disinformation and misinformation on the media or I should say social media and the internet.
I'm just thinking from a strategy perspective, it's having the right people in the room to write the strategy, which was something we kind of picked up earlier. But then actually that how you translate that through a sincere, as you've just said, sincere communication plan that actually gives the messages in the right way to the right people. But then you need to go so much further and go, and it can't stop there. It's about how we then create the not even just the operational plan, but that has to filter into roles and responsibilities and the culture in which we enable our employees and colleagues to manage because we can't have a culture that is supportive of mistakes and failure, obviously within margins that work for that business, if we don't give people autonomy to act. And we can't do that if we don't have a structure that goes, this is how as a company we communicate, and these are the channels, and then within these, this enables behaviours and values that are linked to our strategy and our company. And it's that thread all the way through, isn't it, about here's what you want to do, how does that transcend into how that person can work on that particular day, and the messaging and the freedom they have to act, but the clarity that they have to direct them in that action.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you said a number of things are really powerful there. You just can't put people in roles. You have to empower them and give them context around their autonomy and really import. The other piece you're talking about there is quite important, is the piece of, all right, if we're going to really make this work, we know information can change behavior, but it is not enough, not sufficient to move social norms and move a culture. And so from reams and 100 years of research and behavior change, yes, you have to have information. Yes, you have to have messaging, but then there needs to be action behind it. But now let's go back to something most people will understand. That's an academic system.
Yeah.
That's education. And so we keep going back to, if we look at mature systems and how they work, we can walk some things over, and then we can contextualize research in these very key contexts to go, this works, or this nuance brings it to another level in this context. We don't want to overgeneralize, but a lot of these problems have been solved. But we have to look to more mature, complex systems to think about the human being in the system and then the human factors that move the system. But when you create a culture, it requires action. In the same way, I'll go back and, and look at, when you look at cultures, and there's strong research on this, about when democracies fail, it's an inability, inaction. And then you have energy, again, energy systems moving it in a different direction. To take care of a democracy, you have to have communications, and then action and empowerment for that action. And so we sometimes forget these principles of psychology and neuroscience. They are not that complex. To enact them takes a lot of energy. But we understand this stuff, and most people, we can bring it down to, I see this every day, but we have to put energy behind it. And when we choose our priorities differently, then we're choosing energy away from people first. Number one rule of high performance and special operations is people matter more than hardware and technology. You break rule number one, you better go back to learn rule number one and enact it.
Thank you very much. I think one of the keys, and I know we've said it already, I think the key takeaway that I've had from this morning, and I appreciate this is your getting into late evening over in New Zealand, is that ultimately, performance is health in motion. Health is vital for us to succeed across any element of life, in any setting. We need to remember that we can't control everything, but what we can do is use the process model, the holistic model of physical activity, rest and recovery, optimum nutrition, the right cognitive load, emotional management, socialization in synergy, and understand and do what we can to understand each of those levels, and then work out how we can better manage and influence those things across our own lives, and then also how we can do our bit to manage and influence them for people that we lead, people that we work with, people that we care about, in the best way possible through messaging, authentic and sincere communication, and processes and structures that we can influence and manage that enables that culture for them to perform at their best. So thank you ever so much for your time.
It's been a great pleasure, and I appreciate the invitation to have the conversation, so thank you.
No, thank you very much. It was a real pleasure speaking with John, and our conversations have directly informed sections of Balancing Act on resilience and the science of performance. If you'd like to explore any of the themes discussed today further, you can visit the Balancing Act website to learn more about the book, hear from other experts and high performers, and continue the conversation around leadership, performance and wellbeing at www.balancing-act.co.uk. Thank you so much for joining us today.